Hello again. This is video number 2 of module 4, I think it is. This is our art to philosophy transition, which I talked about in the first video. And so now I'm going to introduce you quickly to those ancient Athenian philosophers, Plato and Socrates. That name Socrates is probably as famous as the name of Confucius, maybe even more so in the English-speaking world. And as we did with Confucius, you might think for a moment what you associate with that name, Socrates. When you hear that name, what do you think? Can even pause the video for a second to think about that. This Socrates for us is in many ways the first major philosopher of the Western tradition, the tradition that we currently stand in. Philosophy flows back in time from the present moment in America, eventually to this guy Socrates. And in a way, he got it all started. He wasn't the only philosopher of his day. There were other people wandering around trying to figure out the nature of things. But Socrates had a particular interest in the philosophical endeavor, and it was focused on community and focused on morality, focused on the question of how are we going to treat each other. So he lived at the time of this Athenian democracy. He lived at the time of a community that was struggling with the Greek question. And he lived at the time of tragic theater. So he would have gone to those plays. He would have seen Antigone, most likely. But interestingly, he was not interested in government at all. He basically thought it was a bit of a sham that people in the democracy were looking out for their own interest, that they weren't, when it comes down to it, morally responsible people. So he would spend his time just going to the marketplace and talking to people, asking them about their values and how they arrived at them. A quick example of that, I hope this isn't too hard to track, but there's a dialogue that Plato wrote where Socrates is talking to a guy named Euthyphro. And Euthyphro, they run into each other at the courthouse. And Socrates is like, "What are you doing here?" And Euthyphro says, "Well, I've brought my father to court. I've charged him with murder. And I want to convict him of murder." And Socrates says, "That's kind of incredible, because around here, nobody would do that to their family." And I for the first time, because of this class, I've connected the Euthyphro with Confucius. So this should call to mind the father stealing a sheep kind of thing. What do you do? Well, in the case of this guy Euthyphro, it was clear. If he thought his dad had committed murder somehow, he would take him to court and try to get him charged. But Socrates is still very curious. Like, what do you know about justice and what do you know about morality that you could do that so confidently? And so they start to talk. And the thing that usually happens when you talk to Socrates is that you have ways of justifying things to yourself. But when Socrates asks you a lot of questions, turns out the way you're thinking about it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. So that's what happens in the conversation. And the Euthyphro says, I'm doing it for these reasons, and those reasons break down, and he's suddenly very confused about himself. And that's how it went with Socrates usually. So he'd go around talking to people like this, and it could be very frustrating for people. In fact, and this is serious and tragic, ultimately that Athenian community, enough of them got sick and tired of Socrates that they charged him with dishonoring the gods and corrupting the youth. But these were kind of trumped up charges because they were sick and tired of him, basically. The trial itself is another dialogue that you can read. And for various reasons, it leads to Socrates getting the death penalty, and Socrates, in fact, historically in Athens, being put to death, drinking poison hemlock and dying because of this charge. So this is serious stuff. Philosophy is serious stuff. Plato was his student. And so Plato became the writer who writes the dialogues. And this is how we know Socrates. It's through Plato, which we could maybe wonder, did Plato get it right? But Socrates, the image of Socrates, comes down to us through Plato texts. He wrote mostly dialogue, so it's usually a Plato text is Socrates talking with people, and that's the text we've given you to read this week. It's from a very long discussion, a long dialogue called the Republic. And the Republic means something more like, it'd be better to call it something like the best society or the best government, best political system. It's just a long conversation about the question that if we're interested in justice, what should society look like? So very long conversation about that topic. And we're actually getting two moments of arguments in the early part of the Republic. So what we've asked you to read proposes two different ideas about what it is to treat other people justly. The first one is, as you'll see in the reading, is to pay your debts and tell the truth. Pay your debts and tell the truth. Somebody proposes that as a definition of justice. Socrates starts asking questions. The logic doesn't hold up so well. And then a new definition of justice pops up. And that definition is to help your friends and harm your enemies. There's even, this is a very popular way to think at the time. I think it's a very popular way to think now. And in fact, they're in Antigone's very first little speech, the very first thing she says ends with this line: "Our enemies are on the march to hurt our friends." She says this to her sister Ismene. Our enemies are on the march to hurt our friends. So that becomes the definition of justice that these people having a conversation with Socrates start to throw around. Help your friends, harm your enemies. So what we're doing in this transition from art to philosophy is you're taking a look at how Socrates takes a proposition, a moral proposition. Here's how you should treat other people: help friends, harm enemies. And he subjects it to inquiry, to examination, asking questions, seeing if it makes sense. Once again, maybe you'll be convinced, maybe you won't. But once again, in the course of the conversation, that definition breaks down and they have to go looking for a different definition after that. So the experience of this module is to get a taste of that kind of philosophy, how you can have a proposition and ask questions about it, and see what you think of that approach to becoming more wise about morality. That's what Socrates would claim is happening when you examine moral propositions. You're testing them to see if they are, in fact, the best way to think about morality. All right. Good luck with the reading.